Today, we are diving into the U.S. national debt. And look, this isn't just some abstract story about gigantic numbers. It's about real consequences that are playing out as we speak. So let's get right into it. Okay, so to really wrap our heads around what we're talking about, we've got to start with the numbers. And honestly, they are just staggering. I mean, we're not talking about a slow leak here. This is a full-on fire hose.
So here it is. As of early 2026, the U.S. national debt is sitting at nearly $39 trillion. That's a number so big, it's hard to even imagine, right? It almost feels fake, but trust me, its growth is very, very real. But here's the part that really gets me. It's the sheer speed of it. You see that number? That is how much the debt is going up every single second. Seriously, by the time I'm done talking right now, we will have added hundreds of thousands more dollars to the pile. It's just incredible.
So the big question is, how did things get so out of control so fast? Well, a huge piece of this puzzle, it really boils down to one single massive piece of legislation that just slammed the accelerator on the nation's borrowing.
That driver was the 2025 Reconciliation Act, or Public Law 11921, if you want to get formal. Basically, what it did was combine some pretty major tax cuts with some really big changes in federal spending. And the result? It blew a massive new hole right in the middle of the federal budget.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Let's look at the analysis from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. They're projecting this one act will add, get this, $3.4 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. And even when you look at models that try to account for economic growth, like the one from Penn Wharton, they still put the number at over $3 trillion. The takeaway here is pretty undeniable. This one bill is really the main engine driving this current debt surge.
So you might be wondering, what exactly was in this thing? Well, it wasn't just your typical broad tax cuts. No, this bill got into some really specific, almost kind of weird provisions. I'm talking about things like brand new deductions for tip and overtime pay for some people, a deduction on your car loan interest, but only if the car was assembled in the U.S., and even these government-funded savings accounts for kids that got nicknamed Trump accounts. Just a whole mix of things.
Okay, so with spending about to go through the roof, the administration knew they had to look like they were doing something to control it. So they launched this big, high-profile initiative to hunt down savings. It was called the Department of Government Efficiency, or, yes, DOGE. And its mission, on paper, was simple: slash government waste and fraud.
And if you looked at their public-facing savings tracker, well, it looked like a huge success. The official number they were throwing around was $215 billion in savings. It really gave the impression that, hey, they were serious about getting spending under control.
But you knew there was a but coming, right? When independent auditors and journalists started to poke around and really dig into the details, the numbers, well, they just didn't hold up. They found this huge gap between what was being claimed and what was actually happening. We're talking accounting errors, but also this really tricky distinction. See, it's one thing to say you're cutting the maximum possible cost of a contract, and it's another thing entirely to cut what you were actually planning to spend. And that difference is key. Want to hear the most jaw-dropping example? They claimed a massive $8 billion saving. It turns out it was actually an $8 million contract. Someone just made a typo when they entered it into the system. I mean, come on. That one single clerical error completely warped the department's early numbers. And you can imagine, it just poured gasoline on the fire of skepticism about their claims. All right, so let's set aside the politics and the fuzzy accounting for a second. What is the real economic threat here? It all boils down to a concept that economists have a great name for: the fiscal scissors. It's actually a pretty simple idea. The fiscal scissors is what happens when a country's debt starts growing way, way faster than its actual economy, its GDP. When those two lines on a graph start to move apart, it's like the blades of a pair of scissors opening up. And that gap, that's where the danger lies. It's a huge threat to long-term economic stability.
And this chart shows you exactly what that looks like in reality. Right now, the U.S. debt is climbing by about 5 to 6% every year. But the economy, our GDP, that's only growing at around 2.2%. You don't have to be a math whiz to see the problem. The debt is growing more than twice as fast as our ability to actually pay for it.
So what does that mean in the real world? In one word, interest. The cost just to pay the interest on all this debt is absolutely exploding. The CBO is projecting that by 2036, just the interest payments, nothing else, could eat up almost 19% of the entire federal budget. That's money that can't be spent on defense, on medical research, on fixing our roads and bridges, you name it.
And this isn't just an American problem.
The U.S. debt is, for better or worse, kind of the bedrock of the entire global financial system. So the path we choose from here, it's a really high-stakes gamble, not just for the U.S., but for everyone. And there are some incredibly difficult choices looming.
If you want a sense of how the world is viewing this, just look at who is buying and selling our debt. It tells a really interesting story. On one hand, you have allies like the UK and Japan who are actually buying more. But on the other hand, you have major players like China and Brazil who have been selling off big chunks of their holdings. They're diversifying, moving their money elsewhere. It really hints that the global appetite for U.S. debt might be starting to change. And as if that weren't enough, there's another clock ticking down, and it's getting loud. Major government trust funds, the big ones, are getting dangerously close to empty. The Highway Trust Fund is set to run out of money in 2028. Social Security's main fund, depleted by 2032. These aren't just dates on a calendar. They're fiscal cliffs. They are deadlines that are going to force Congress to make some incredibly tough, painful decisions.
Now, people aren't just ignoring this. There are ideas being floated about how to fix it. The one you hear about most is creating some kind of bipartisan fiscal commission, basically getting a group from both parties in a room to come up with the tough recommendations on taxes and spending. Other folks are looking at just reforming the whole budget process itself, trying to build in more discipline from the start.
When you boil it all down, the United States is staring down the barrel of what experts are calling an ahistorical adjustment. That's a fancy way of saying the path we're on is completely unsustainable. So the question isn't if things are going to change, it's how. Are our leaders going to choose to make gradual, planned, maybe painful reforms now? Or are they going to wait until a full-blown financial crisis hits and forces their hand? The answer to that question is going to shape the American economy for a generation to come.